main battle tank, also known as a battle tank, a universal tank, is a tank that fills the armor-protected direct fire and maneuver role of many modern armies. They were originally conceived to replace the light, medium, heavy and super heavy tanks. Development was spurred in the Cold War with the development of lightweight composite armor. They are still supplemented in some armies with light tanks. Not all armored, tracked-in military vehicles are tanks and are designed for other battlefield roles. Today, main battle tanks are considered a key component of modern armies. Modern MBTs seldom operate alone, as they are organized into armored units which involve the support of infantry, who may accompany the MBTs in infantry fighting vehicles. They are also often supported by surveillance or ground attack aircraft. Development history. Previous tank concepts, early World War II and prior in World War I, tanks were classed into light, medium, and heavy based on weight, and its impact on speed and mobility. As tank combat evolved, tank design suffered from a number of limitations due largely to engine power and transmission capability. A designer could produce a tank with high maneuverability, armor, or a large gun, but generally not all three at the same time. Combined with interwar tank theory which stressed high-speed dashes into the rear of the enemy's lines. These limitations led naturally to two classes of tanks that continued through much of World War II. The first prioritized maneuverability, and thus had a limit on weight. These were known variously as light tanks, medium tanks, cruiser tanks, or even tankets for the very smallest versions. These tanks had different uses depending on the country's tank doctrine, but were generally used to exploit holes in the enemy lines and round far into the rear areas in self-supporting armored groups. This would disrupt enemy logistics and command and control, as well as delay the movement of reserves to the front. It was believed operations of this sort would undermine or completely destroy the ability for the frontline troops to continue battle. The second class prioritized armor and thus weighed more, limiting maneuverability. These were known as heavy tanks, infantry tanks, or assault tanks. They were generally designed to assault enemy lines, working in concert with frontline infantry, as these were expected to move forward at the same speed as the men. Higher speeds were not required and the engine power could instead be used to carry a much greater load. Infantry tanks featured much larger amounts of armor, heavier guns, and more track area to allow them to cross a shell-riddled battlefield. As the nature of tank warfare evolved, tanks designed for other specialized roles also saw development. This included dedicated tank destroyers and engineer tanks such as Hobart's funnies. Tank destroyers had varied successes, and often ended up engaging enemy infantry instead of their intended targets. German assault gun armored vehicles like the Sturmgeschütz III were found effective in an anti-tank role. Evolution of medium tanks. Late World War II. In spite of a great amount of theory and pre-war testing, the plans for armored combat quickly proved themselves outdated. The battlefield did not bog down like it did in World War I and tended to be much more mobile. This was especially evident in the great sweeping battles in North Africa and the Soviet Union, where armored forces executed drives of hundreds of miles. In these cases the problems with having two designs became especially evident. The tanks able to go toe-to-toe with the enemy were generally found miles to the rear, trying to catch up. Those able to maintain the drive were lightly armored, and proved easy prey for enemy anti-tank guns and rifles. In response to this new threat, light tanks were generally consigned to the reconnaissance role, while medium tanks were developed with improved armor, able to defeat anti-tank rifles and most smaller guns while retaining a reasonable level of mobility. As these evolved, the tank's own weapons had to grow larger larger in order to deal with enemy tanks with the same level of armor. This evolution led to the development of a more general-purpose medium tank, which dominated combat in the second half of the war. Medium tanks formed the bulk of the tank combat forces. Generally, these designs massed about 25 to 30 tons, were armed with cannons around 75 mm, and powered by engines in the 400 to 500 horsepower range. Notable examples include the Soviet T-34, the most produced tank to that time, the German Panzer IV, and the US M4 Sherman. The widespread production of these designs led to most others being pushed out of service or into niche roles, often competing on numbers rather than armor. Universal tank. The rapid increase in engine power in the aviation world had trickle-down effects to tank development. In Britain, tank development had continued down the parallel development of cruiser tanks and infantry tanks, light tanks having been dropped in favor of other reconnaissance vehicles. Development of the Rolls-Royce Meteor engine for the Cromwell tank, combined with efficiency savings elsewhere in the design, almost doubled the available horsepower for cruiser tanks. This increase led to speculation of a universal tank, able to take on the role of both cruiser and infantry tank with both armor and maneuverability. Design of a universal tank commenced, but was ultimately overtaken by events. Continued development of the basic Cromwell design led eventually to the Centurion. This design's armor was able to defeat all small and medium anti-tank guns, enabling the cruiser tank to take on an infantry tank role as well. The tank also mounted a gun able to defeat even the largest enemy tanks, and offered greater maneuverability than most earlier light, medium, and cruiser tank designs. Development of the universal tank ceased, and Centurion entered service just as World War II finished, becoming a multi-role vehicle forming the main battle tank force of the British Army. This paved the way for a new tank classification, the main battle tank, and Centurion is considered by many to be the first MBT. Cold War. A surplus of effective World War II-era designs in other forces, notably the US and Soviet Union, led to slower introductions of similar designs on the part. By the early 1950s, these designs were clearly no longer competitive, especially in a world of shaped charge weapons, and new designs rapidly emerged from most armed forces. The concept of the medium tank gradually evolved into the MBT in the 1960s, as it was realized that medium tanks could carry guns that could penetrate any practical level of armor at long range. Also, the heaviest tanks were unable to use most existing bridges. The World War II concept of heavy tanks, armed with the most powerful guns and heaviest armor, became obsolete because the large tanks were too expensive and just as vulnerable to damage by mines, bombs, rockets and artillery. Likewise, World War II had shown that lightly armed and armored tanks were of limited value in most roles. Even reconnaissance vehicles had shown a trend towards heavier weight and greater firepower during World War II. Speed was not a substitute for armor and firepower. An increasing variety of anti-tank weapons and the perceived threat of a nuclear war prioritized the need for additional armor. The additional armor prompted the design of even more powerful guns. The main battle tank thus took on the role the British had once called the universal tank, exemplified by the Centurion, filling almost all battlefield roles. Typical main battle tanks were as well armed as any other vehicle on the battlefield, highly mobile, and well armored, yet they were cheap enough to be built in large numbers. The first Soviet main battle tank was the T-64 and the first American nomenclature-designated MBT was the M60 Patton. Anti-tank weapons rapidly outpaced armor developments. By the 1960s, anti-tank rounds could penetrate a meter of steel so as to make the application of traditional rolled homogeneous armor unpragmatic. The first solution to this problem was the British job bomb armor. This composite armor utilized layers of ceramics and other materials to help attenuate the effects of high-explosive anti-tank munitions. Another threat came by way of the widespread use of helicopters in battle. Before the advent of helicopters, armor was heavily concentrated to the front of the tank. This new threat caused designs to distribute armor on all sides of the tank. By the late 1970s, MBTs were manufactured by China, France, West Germany, Britain, India, Italy, Japan, the Soviet Union, Sweden, Switzerland, and the United States. The Soviet Union's war doctrine depended heavily on the main battle tank. Any weapon advancement making the MBT obsolete could have devastated the Soviet Union's fighting capability. The Soviet Union made novel advancements to the weapons systems, including mechanical autoloaders and anti-tank guided missiles. Autoloaders were introduced to replace the human loader, permitting the turret to be reduced in size, making the target smaller and less visible, while missile systems were added to extend the range at which a vehicle could engage a target and thereby enhance the first round hit probability. The United States' experience in the Vietnam War contributed to the idea among Army leadership that the role of the main battle tank could be fulfilled by attack helicopters. During the Vietnam War, helicopters and missiles competed with MBTs for research money. Persian Gulf War. Though the Persian Gulf War reaffirmed the role of main battle tanks, MBTs were outperformed by the attack helicopter. Other strategists considered that the MBT was entirely obsolete in the light of the efficacy and speed with which coalition forces neutralized Iraqi armor. Asymmetrical warfare. In asymmetric warfare, threats such as improvised explosive devices and mines have proven themselves effective against MBTs. In response, nations that face asymmetric warfare, such as Israel, are reducing the size of the tank fleet and procuring more advanced models. The United States Army used 1,100 M1 Abrams in the course of the Iraq War. They proved to have an unexpectedly high vulnerability to improvised explosive devices, a relatively new type of remotely detonated mine. The explosively formed penetrator was used with some success against American armored vehicles. However, with upgrades to the rear armor, M1s proved to be valuable in urban combat. At the Battle of Fallujah, the United States Marines brought in 2 extra companies of M1s. Britain deployed its Challenger 2 tanks to support its operations in southern Iraq. Advanced armor has not improved vehicle survivability, but has reduced crew fatalities. Small unmanned turrets on top of the cupolas, called remote weapon stations armed with machine guns or mortars, provide improved defense and enhance crew survivability. Experimental tanks with unmanned turrets locate crew members in the heavily armored hull, improving survivability and reducing the vehicle's profile. Technology is reducing the weight and size of the modern MBT. A British military document from 2001 indicated that the British Army would not procure a replacement for the Challenger 2 because of a lack of conventional warfare threats in the foreseeable future. The obsolescence of the tank has been asserted, but the history of the late 20th and early 21st century suggested that MBTs were still necessary. Main battle tanks remain a useful tool for internal security. Nations lacking expeditionary ambitions, or even credible land-based threats from abroad, bolstering the ground forces with MBTs for the express purpose of maintaining internal security. Design. A main battle tank has been officially described by the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe as a self-propelled armored fighting vehicle, capable of heavy firepower, primarily of a high muzzle velocity direct fire main gun necessary to engage armored and other targets, with high cross-country mobility, with a high level of self-protection, and which is not designed and equipped primarily to transport combat troops. Overview. Countermeasures. Originally, most MBTs relied on steel armor to defend against various threats. As newer threats emerged, however, the defensive systems used by MBTs had to evolve to counter them. One of the first new developments was the use of explosive reactive armor, developed by Israel in the early 1980s to defend against the shaped charge warheads of modern anti-tank guided missiles and other such high explosive anti-tank projectiles. This technology was subsequently adopted and expanded upon by the United States and the Soviet Union. MBT armor is concentrated at the front of the tank, where it is layered up to 33 centimeters thick. Missiles are cheap and cost-effective anti-tank weapons. Era can be quickly added to vehicles to increase the survivability. However, the detonation of ERA blocks creates a hazard to any supporting infantry near the tank. Despite this drawback, it is still employed on many Russian MBTs, the latest generation, Contact 5, being capable of defeating both heat and kinetic energy penetrator threats. The Soviets also developed active protection systems designed to more actively neutralize hostile projectiles before they could even strike the tank, namely the Shtora and Arena systems. The United States has also adopted similar technologies in the form of the Missile Countermeasure Device and as part of the Tank Urban Survival Kit, used on M1 Abrams tanks serving in Iraq. The latest Russian MBT, the T-14 Armata, incorporates an AESA radar as part of its Afghanit APS and in conjunction with the rest of its armament, can also intercept aircraft and missiles. MBTs can also be protected from radar detection by incorporating stealth technology. The T-14 Armata has a turret designed to be harder to detect with radars and thermal sights. Advanced camouflage like the Russian Nakidka will also reduce the radar and thermal signatures of a MBT. The use of electric engines, such as the ones being considered for use on the Turkish Altai, can also reduce the thermal signature of the tank. Other defensive developments focused on improving the strength of the armor itself. One of the notable advancements coming from the British with the development of Chobham armor in the 1970s. It was first employed on the American M1 Abrams and later the British Challenger 1. Chobham armor uses a lattice of composite and ceramic materials, along with metal alloys to defeat incoming threats, and prove highly effective in the conflicts in Iraq in the early 1990s and 2000s, surviving numerous impacts from 1950 to 60 S-era rocket-propelled grenades with negligible damage. It is much less efficient against later models of RPGs. For example, the RPG-29 from the 1980s is able to penetrate the frontal hull armor of the Challenger 2. Weaponry. Main battle tanks are equipped with a main tank gun and at least one machine gun. MBT main guns are generally between 90 and 130 mm caliber and can fire both anti-armor and, more recently, anti-personnel rounds. The cannon serves a dual role, able to engage other armored targets such as tanks and fortifications, and soft targets such as light vehicles and infantry. It is fixed to the turret, along with the loading and fire mechanism. Modern tanks utilize a sophisticated fire control system, including rangefinders, computerized fire control, and stabilizers, which are designed to keep the cannon stable and aimed even if the hull is turning or shaking, making it easier for the operators to fire on the move and or against moving targets. Gun missile systems are complicated and have been particularly unsatisfactory to the United States, who abandoned gun missile projects such as the M60A2 and MBT-70, but have been diligently developed by the Soviet Union, who even retrofitted them to T-55 tanks, in an effort to double the effective range of the vehicle's fire. The MBT's role could be compromised because of the increasing distances involved and the increased reliance on indirect fire. The tank gun is still useful in urban combat for precisely delivering powerful fire while minimizing collateral damage. High-explosive anti-tank and some form of high-velocity kinetic energy penetrator, such as APF-SDS rounds, are carried for anti-armor purposes. Anti-personnel rounds such as high-explosive or high-explosive fragmentation have dual purpose. Less common rounds are beehive anti-personnel rounds, and high-explosive squash head rounds used for both anti-armor and bunker busting. Usually, an MBT carries 30 to 50 rounds of ammunition for its main gun, usually split between heat and kinetic energy penetrator rounds. Some MBTs may also carry smoker white phosphorus rounds. Some MBTs are equipped with an autoloader, such as the French Leclerc, or the Russian, Ukrainian T-64, T-72, T-80, T-84, T-90, and T-14, and, for this reason, the crew can be reduced to 3 members. MBTs with an autoloader require one less crew member, and the autoloader requires less space than its human counterpart, allowing for a reduction in turret size. Further, an autoloader can be designed to handle rounds which would be too difficult for a human to load. This reduces the silhouette, which improves the MBT's target profile. However, with a manual loader, the rounds can be isolated within a blowout chamber, rather than a magazine within the turret, which could improve crew survivability. However, the force of a modern depleted uranium armor-piercing fin-discarding sabot round at the muzzle can exceed 6,000 kilonewtons. Composite plus reactive armor could withstand this kind of force through its deflection and deformation, but with a second hit in the same area, an armor breach is inevitable. As such, the speed of follow-up shots is crucial within tank-to-tank combat. As secondary weapons, an MBT usually uses between 2 and 4 machine guns to engage infantry and light vehicles. Many MBTs mount one heavy-caliber anti-aircraft machine gun, usually of 50 caliber, which can be used against helicopters and low-flying aircraft. However, their effectiveness is limited in comparison to dedicated anti-aircraft artillery. The tank's machine guns are usually equipped with between 500 and 3,000 rounds each. Mobility MBTs, like previous models of tanks, move on treads, which allow a decent level of mobility over most terrain including sand and mud. They also allow tanks to climb over most obstacles. MBTs can be made watertight, so they can even dive into shallow water with snorkel. However, treads are not as fast as wheels. The maximum speed of a tank is about 65 km/h for the Leopard 2. The extreme weight of vehicles of this type also limits the speed. They are usually equipped with a 1,200 to 1,500 horsepower engine, with an operational range near 500 kilometers. The German army has prioritized mobility in its Leopard 2, which is considered the fastest MBT in existence. The MBT is often cumbersome in traffic and frequently obstructs the normal flow of traffic. The tracks can damage some roads after repeated use. Many structures like bridges do not have the load capacity to support an MBT. In the fast pace of combat, it is often impossible to test the sturdiness of these structures. In the 2003 invasion of Iraq, an M1 Abrams attempting to cross a bridge to evade enemy fire plummeted into the Euphrates River when the bridge collapsed. Though appreciated for its excellent off-road characteristics, the MBT can become immobilized in muddy conditions. The high cost of MBTs can be attributed in part to the high-performance engine transmission system and to the fire control system. Also, propulsion systems are not produced in high enough quantities to take advantage of economies of scale. Crew fatigue limits the operational range of MBTs in combat. Reducing the crew to 3 and relocating all crew members from the turret to the hull could provide time to sleep for one off-shift crew member, located in the rear of the hull. In this scenario, crew members would rotate shifts regularly and all would require cross-training on all vehicle job functions. Cargo aircraft are instrumental to the timely deployment of MBTs. The absence of sufficient numbers of strategic airlift assets can limit the rate of MBT deployments to the number of aircraft available. Military planners anticipate that the airlift capability for MBTs will not improve in the future. To date, no helicopter has the capability to lift MBTs. Rail and road are heavily used to move MBTs nearer to the battle, ready to fight in prime condition. Where well-maintained roads allow it, wheeled tank transporters can be used. The difficult task of resupply is usually accomplished with large trucks. Storage. Main battle tanks have internal and external storage space. Internal space is reserved for ammunition. External space enhances independence of logistics and can accommodate extra fuel and some personal equipment of the crew. The Israeli Merkava can even accommodate crew members displaced from a destroyed vehicle in its ammunition compartment. Crew emphasis is placed on selecting and training main battle tank crew members. A crew must perform the tasks faultlessly and harmoniously, so commanders select teams taking into consideration personalities and talents. Role. The main battle tank fulfills the role the British had once called the universal tank, filling almost all battlefield roles. They were originally designed in the Cold War to combat other MBTs. The modern light tank supplements the MBT in expeditionary roles and situations where all major threats have been neutralized and excess weight in armor and armament would only hinder mobility and cost more money to operate. Reconnaissance by MBTs is performed in high-intensity conflicts where reconnaissance by light vehicles would be insufficient due to the necessity to fight for information. In asymmetric warfare, main battle tanks are deployed in small, highly concentrated units. MBTs fire only at targets at close range and instead rely on external support such as unmanned aircraft for long-range combat. Main battle tanks have significantly varied characteristics. Procuring too many varieties can place a burden on tactics, training, support and maintenance. The MBT has a positive morale effect on the infantry it accompanies. It also instills fear in the opposing force, who can often hear and even feel their arrival. Procurement. Research and development. Manufacture. MBT production is increasingly being outsourced to wealthy nations. Countries that are just beginning to produce tanks are having difficulties remaining profitable in an industry that is increasingly becoming more expensive through sophistication of technology. Even some large-scale producers are seeing declines in production. Even China is divesting many of its MBTs. The production of main battle tanks is limited to manufacturers that specialize in combat vehicles. Commercial manufacturers of civilian vehicles cannot easily be repurposed as MBT production facilities. Prices for MBTs have more than tripled from 1943 to 2011, although this pales in comparison with the price increase in fighter aircraft from 1943 to 1975. Marketing several MBT models, such as the AMX-40 and AV-40, were marketed almost solely as export vehicles. Several tank producers, such as Japan and Israel, choose not to market their creations for export. Others have export control laws in place.